There's a purity in spaceship games, shoot-em-ups, that's hard to find these days. There was no open world, no skill tree, no complex narrative. It was just you, your ship, and a screen that never stopped sending enemies your way. It was a test of reflexes, pattern memorization, and above all, persistence. Today, we're not just going to list 10 good games. We're going to analyze the 10 pillars that built this genre. Games that weren't just fun, but introduced mechanics, raised the level of challenge, and created the rulebook that many others would follow for decades. When I think of In the Hunt, the first thing that comes to mind isn't a spaceship, but the smell of wet metal and the feeling of claustrophobia. This game is a wonderful anomaly in the genre. In an era dominated by starfighters and warplanes, Irene decided to put us in control of a submarine. This decision alone completely changes the pace and approach. The game's art is a spectacle in itself. It's the DNA of what we would later see in Metal Slug. Every pixel looks dirty, industrial, and heavy. You feel the weight of your submarine as it navigates through tight caves and submerged cities. The gameplay perfectly reflects this design. Your submarine is slow, and that's not a flaw. It's a central characteristic. You can't simply dodge everything with quick reflexes. In the Hunt requires planning. You need to anticipate enemy movements and, more importantly, use the environment to your advantage. The shooting mechanics are divided. Torpedoes that go forward and missiles that are launched in an arc upwards, hitting targets on the surface or on higher platforms. This duality in attack forces you to manage two danger zones at the same time, something few shmups do so effectively. What defines the era for In the Hunt is precisely its courage to be different. It proved that a shoot-'em-up didn't have to be about speed and ballets of shots in space. It could be about atmosphere, tactical positioning, and a more methodical exploration of the environment. The bosses are colossal and creative war machines that really seem part of that industrial and decrepit world. Facing them isn't just a matter of memorizing patterns, but of finding the weak point in a structure that seems impenetrable. When I think of In the Hunt, the first thing that comes to mind isn't a spaceship, but the smell of wet metal and the feeling of claustrophobia. This game is a wonderful anomaly in the genre. In an era dominated by starfighters and warplanes, Irene decided to put us in control of a submarine. This decision alone completely changes the pace and approach. The game's art is a spectacle in itself. It's the DNA of what we would later see in Metal Slug. Every pixel looks dirty, industrial, and heavy. You feel the weight of your submarine as it navigates through tight caves and submerged cities. The gameplay perfectly reflects this design. Your submarine is slow, and that's not a flaw. It's a central characteristic. You can't simply dodge everything with quick reflexes. In the Hunt requires planning. You need to anticipate enemy movements and, more importantly, use the environment to your advantage. The shooting mechanics are divided. Torpedoes that go forward and missiles that are launched in an arc upwards, hitting targets on the surface or on higher platforms. This duality in attack forces you to manage two danger zones at the same time, something few shmups do so effectively. What defines the era for In the Hunt is precisely its courage to be different. It proved that a shoot-'em-up didn't have to be about speed and ballets of shots in space. It could be about atmosphere, tactical positioning, and a more methodical exploration of the environment. The bosses are colossal and creative war machines that really seem part of that industrial and decrepit world. Facing them isn't just a matter of memorizing patterns, but of finding the weak point in a structure that seems impenetrable. When Gunbird arrived in arcades, it brought something that was becoming increasingly important: personality. Developed by Saikyo, a master of the genre, this game departed from military seriousness or dark science fiction. Instead, it gave us a colorful, anime-inspired fantasy world with a cast of charismatic characters. You were no longer piloting a generic ship. You were controlling Marion, the young witch, or Ash, the German adventurer. This simple change had a profound impact on the experience. The gameplay is the pure cream of the Saikyo style. The speed is high, the enemy shots are fast, and your hitbox, the area of your character that can be hit, is small and precise. Each character had a completely different shooting pattern and bomb, encouraging experimentation. The design of the phases and enemies was made to keep you in constant movement, forcing millimetric deviations between projectiles. Saikyo was beginning to pave the way for what would become the bullet hell subgenre, and Gunbird is a crucial step in this evolution. The factor that defined its era was the introduction of character-driven design in the genre. Your choice of character at the beginning was not just cosmetic. It fundamentally dictated your strategy. Some characters were better at dealing with crowds of weak enemies, while others excelled against bosses. In addition, the game had different endings for each character, adding a layer of replayability and narrative that was rare for the genre at the time. Gunbird helped prove that a shoot-'em-up could have as much focus on action as on charisma.
これが願いを叶える鏡か。奴らには必要のない代物だ。
If 1942 was the foundation, and Gunbird brought the personality, R-Type brought the brain. This IRM game is not a reflex shooter. It's a puzzle disguised as a spaceship game. The first time you play R-Type, you are annihilated. Not because you weren't fast enough, but because you didn't know what to do. The game has a deliberately slower pace, and every inch of the screen is designed with lethal intent. The central mechanic that changes everything is the Force. This indestructible spherical unit is your main tool for attack and defense. It can be attached to the front or rear of your ship, absorbing shots and firing its own lasers. Or it can be launched to operate independently, attacking enemies in locations that your ship cannot reach. Added to this, we have the beam cannon, a charged shot that can destroy multiple enemies. Mastering the combined use of the Force and the beam cannon is the key to survival. The legacy of R-Type is undeniable. The Force mechanic was so innovative that it influenced dozens of other games. Its methodical approach and intricate level design showed that shoot-'em-ups could have immense strategic depth. Playing it today is still an intense and, at times, frustrating experience. But for anyone interested in game design, it's a masterclass on how to create meaningful challenges and reward the player's intellect as much as their reflexes. If the shoot-'em-ups of the 90s were a party, Armed Police Batrider would be the grand finale with all the guests on stage at the same time. This racing game is an explosion of content, style, and controlled chaos. It represents the peak of a certain design philosophy, taking elements from several previous games from the studio and combining them into a dense and overwhelming package. The first impression is of sensory overload. The screen is constantly filled with enemies, shots, items, and explosions, all packed by a fantastic soundtrack. The complexity already starts on the selection screen. You don't just choose one character. You can choose an entire team, with characters from other racing games like Mahou Daisaku-sen. This variety of ships and pilots, each with unique shooting patterns and bombs, offers absurd replayability. The scoring mechanics are also deep, involving the collection of medals and the maintenance of a chain sequence to maximize your score. It's a game that operates on multiple layers. Surviving is the first challenge, but mastering the scoring system is the true ultimate goal. Batrider defined the end of its era by being the culmination of the pre-Danmaku shoot-'em-up, or on the edge of it. It has elements of bullet hell, with more complex shooting patterns, but still maintains a focus on destroying enemies and managing the chaos on the screen. instead of just navigating through curtains of bullets. It is the pinnacle of the complexity and intensity of the Raising Arcades, a legendary studio. It took the charismatic characters formula from games like Gunbird and elevated it to a new level with its team system and its immense roster. For a long time, Armed Police Batrider was a holy grail of the genre, as it did not have a port for home consoles for years, solidifying its status as an arcade legend. This game is a true anomaly, and that's why it stands out. When talking about 16-bit shoot-'em-ups, the mind usually goes to the fast-scrolling classics of the Mega Drive or PC Engine. Typhoon Thompson, however, was something completely different. Released for the Atari SAT, it looked more like a physics simulation disguised as a shooting game. The first thing anyone notices when playing it is the movement of your aqua helifoil. It doesn't move rigidly like a spaceship. It slides, has inertia, and bounces on the water in an incredibly unique and, at first, difficult to control way. The gameplay abandons forced scrolling and adopts large, open, and multi-directional maps. The goal is not simply to reach the end of the phase, but to explore, rescue the sea children, and fulfill specific objectives. The control of the ship, with its floating physics, is the main challenge and the main characteristic. You need to master the impulse to navigate through tight passages and dodge dangers. Combat exists, but it seems secondary to exploration and precise navigation. It's a game that requires a more subtle touch than most shmups. Typhoon Thompson helped define the era of 16-bit computers, like the Atari SAT and the Amiga, as platforms for experimentation. While consoles focused on more direct arcade experiences, computers were home to games that broke molds. This title merged elements of exploration, physics-based puzzles, and shooting in a way that few have done. It showed that the shoot-'em-up genre didn't need to be confined to linear corridors and predefined enemy patterns. My view on it is that it's a fascinating game, but not for everyone. The learning curve of the controls is steep and can frustrate those who expect immediate action. However, once you click with the physics, the experience becomes almost zen. There is enormous satisfaction in gliding perfectly through the water, dodging an obstacle at the last second, and performing a precise rescue. Gradius from 1985 is not just a milestone in the history of shoot-'em-ups. It's a complete revolution that redefined what we expected from this genre. Konami achieved something extraordinary by transforming what was originally conceived as Scramble 2 into a completely new experience, setting standards that influence games to this day. What fascinates me most is how Hiroyasu Machiguchi and his team managed to create something that completely transcended its origins, establishing a formula so perfect that it became the DNA of Konami's most enduring series. Since its release on May 29, 1985, Gradius has proven that innovation doesn't just come from superior technology, but from intelligent design and creative vision. The power-up system in Gradius is undoubtedly its greatest contribution to the genre and one of the most elegant mechanics ever created in video games. Instead of simply collecting random upgrades, players need to make strategic decisions about when and how to spend their collected red capsules. This power-up bar works like a portable store that allows you to choose between speed, missiles, double shot, laser, options, and shield. The system was inspired by the function keys on a keyboard, and this conceptual simplicity masks an impressive strategic depth. It's ingenious how this system forces players to balance immediate gains against long-term benefits, creating a constant tension that completely elevates the experience. The artistic and sound direction of Gradius established a visual and auditory standard that would become iconic for the entire series. The famous moais, those stone heads from Easter Island, were deliberately included to add an element of mystery to the game, similar to the Nazca lines in Xevious. This seemingly eccentric choice proved brilliant, creating memorable enemies that became symbols of the franchise. When I think of Seawolf, I don't exactly think of a shoot-'em-up in the modern sense, with ships and a screen full of projectiles. I think of the experience of being in a dark arcade in the 70s, looking through a plastic periscope. That cabinet was the soul of the game. Midway didn't just sell software, it sold a simulation, a fantasy. The monochrome screen with a blue film to simulate water, and the raw electronic beeps created an immersion that was pure novelty at the time. It was a game about patience and precision, something that was lost a bit in the frantic search for firepower in later shmups. The goal was straightforward. You had a time limit to sink as many ships as possible that passed at different speeds and distances at the top of the screen. The control was just a button to fire the torpedo and the periscope itself to aim. The simplicity hid a layer of challenge. The torpedoes were not instantaneous. They had a travel time. This forced the player to calculate the lead, to anticipate the movement of the target. Naval mines appeared to block your shots, adding an element of obstacle that required careful timing to be overcome. There were no lives, just the relentless clock, which made every second precious. Seawolf defined an era for being one of the first major arcade hits after Pong. It solidified the idea that video games could be more than abstract sports. They could be combat simulations. It introduced the concept of high score in a way that encouraged competition and replayability. Many later shooting games, especially those with aiming, owe something to the fundamental mechanics of aim, shoot, and lead the target that Seawolf made popular. It was a pillar for the industry. Steel Gunner Submarine, also known as Steel Gunner 2, is the perfect representation of the peak of arcade light gun shooters. Coming from Namco, the game puts you in the first-person perspective, not of a soldier or policeman, but of a gunner aboard an attack submarine. The experience was entirely focused on the cabinet, which featured 2 mounted guns that simulated the controls of a periscope. The feeling of being submerged, hunting targets while missiles and other submarines came in your direction was intense and cinematic for 1990. The game is a pure rail shooter. You don't control the movement of the submarine. Your only function is to aim and shoot. The screen advances automatically through underwater and surface scenarios, throwing waves of enemies in front of you. The targets range from enemy submarines and torpedoes to warships and helicopters. The pace was frenetic, requiring quick aim and ammunition management, or overheating depending on the machine. It was a spectacle of explosions and continuous action, designed to consume tokens and adrenaline. Running on the Namco System 2 board, the same as games like Final Lap and Valkyrie no Densetsu, the technical part was a show. The hardware's ability to handle many moving sprites with smooth scaling created a convincing 3D battlefield, although it was all 2D in fact. The enemy sprites were large and detailed, and the explosion effects were gratifying. The sound was bombastic with digitized voices, sonar alarms, and the thunderous impact of your weapons, all contributing to the immersion of being in a high-tech naval combat. This game defined the apex of a subgenre. While games like Operation Wolf established the foundations of the military light gun shooter, Steel Gunner Submarine refined the formula with a unique theme and a polished audio-visual presentation. B-Wings is one of those games that, for me, represents the first major evolution of the vertical shoot-'em-up. While titles like Xevious established the base, B-Wings, from Data East, introduced a layer of strategy that was uncommon for the time. The central idea was not just to dodge and shoot, but to manage your arsenal in a much more active way. I remember playing the NES version and being fascinated by the possibility of changing the wings of my ship. Each wing was, in practice, a completely different weapon, drastically changing the way you approached each phase. The wings mechanic was the heart of the game. You started with a simple shot, and by destroying certain enemies or formations, you could collect power-ups that attached different types of wings to your ship. There were wings that fired wide lasers, others with multiple shots, some with devastating but slow firepower. This variety forced the player to make tactical decisions. A powerful wing against bosses could be useless against swarms of small and fast enemies. There was a constant risk. As a single collision or enemy shot destroyed your wings, downgrading you to your basic and vulnerable weapon. From a technical point of view, both the arcade and NES versions were competent for 1984. The sprites were functional, if not spectacular, and the screen scroll was consistent. The color palette was typical of the time, with dark space backgrounds punctuated by colorful enemies to make identification easier. On the NES, the game suffered from flicker, blinking sprites, when many elements were on the screen, a common hardware limitation that, in a way, added a chaotic charm to the action. The soundtrack was a repetitive but energetic chiptune that stuck in your head and dictated the rhythm of combat.